Okay, good evening, everyone. I'll go ahead and call this March 12th Planning Commission meeting to order at 6 p.m. I guess I'll bring the gavel. Oop. Next time I'll have more authority with the gavel. Can I get a roll call, please?
Chair Nicole Hendricks.
Here.
Jennifer Willard.
Here.
Yana Semenova.
Here.
Sam Skull. Matt Constantine.
Here.
Ron Heberlein. Andrew Carr.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, moving to citizen input. This is the time that citizens have the opportunity to address Planning Commission regarding any item that is not already scheduled for a formal public hearing. We will also address input during the work session for those interested. Therefore, if any member of the audience, either here in City Hall or via Zoom, would like to speak about any other matter of concern, please raise your hand or send a message to the recorder using the Zoom chat function so that we may hear from you now. If you have not already, please fill out a testimony card and give it to the clerk. Also, when you speak, please state your name and address for the record or state that your address is provided on the testimony card. Is there anyone who would like to testify at this time?
I do not have any attendees on Zoom.
Okay, great. Next opportunity will be during the work session. We'll go ahead and move on to the consideration of our minutes. The February 12th, 2025 minutes were previously distributed. Are there any corrections to those minutes? All right, seeing none, the minutes are approved as distributed. Okay, flew through that. We're going. Okay, next on the agenda is a work session for the Wilsonville Industrial Land Readiness Project. This work session is a chance for the Planning Commission to gain additional understanding of and provide guidance on ongoing legislative projects prior to a public hearing. Process-wise, should I take the public comment now before the staff report?
It's really your prerogative, but I think generally what we do is we have the staff report go first,
okay,
just in case it clarifies any questions people might have.
We will do that then. I'll go ahead and ask the city team to go ahead and give their staff report.
And while Cindy brings that up, I would point out this is the first time we're able to have Matt Lorenzen, our Economic Development Manager with the Planning Commission. So he's a great colleague to work with and appreciate his insights and support on this project. Thank you, Dan. Cooperating.
We'll get there.
Not doing it like I usually do. There we go. Okay. All right. Good evening, Chair Hendricks and Commissioners. My name is Cindy Luxhoy, Associate Planner. And we are here tonight, including Matt and Dan and myself, to seek Planning Commission's input on industrial land use types in Basalt Creek based on information that we provide, as well as prior work session discussions. Topics tonight include the regulatory context that brought Basalt Creek planning area into the urban growth boundary, and how that relates to industrial land. A refocus on industrial land demand, current market conditions, and vacancy rates, and further discussion of the high-tech employment and light industrial land use types. And because there's a lot of content in tonight's presentation, I broke it down into 3 chunks. So I'll talk about the regulatory context, and then we'll have some discussion about that, and then we'll move on to the market discussion, followed by some questions, and then we'll talk lastly about the land use types. So with that, the next few slides are providing background about the regulatory context related to industrial land planning in the metro area. And this is in response to questions and a request for clarification posed by the Commission at the February 12th work session. So since the year 2000, approximately 2,000 acres of land in what is referred to as the South County Industrial Area has been planned by Metro for future employment use. In 2002 and 2004, the Tonkin, Southwest Tualatin, Coffee Creek, and Basalt Creek areas were brought into the urban growth boundary to address a regional need for employment land. Specifically, Metro Ordinance Number 41040B, which is included in the Planning Commission packet as Attachment 1, was adopted on June 24, 2004, to add the Basalt Creek planning area, which is shown in dark green on the map on the left, to the urban growth boundary. At that time, a new limited access major freight arterial also was planned to link these areas in the South County Industrial Area to one another, as well as connect them to the regional freight network. This was referred to as the I-599W connector, and as shown on the right, there were various possible alignments that were being considered for the location of the connector. Lands in the Basalt Creek planning area were referred to as the Tualatin area, which included the main part of the planning area that we call Basalt Creek, and the Coffee Creek area that we refer to as West Railroad, which are shown on the maps, on the inset maps on the left. As Title 11 planning occurred for the area over subsequent years, a preferred alignment for the I-599W connector emerged, generally shown as the black dotted line on the map on the right. This alignment was the southernmost of the alignments considered and followed the approximate course of the south alignment on the 2040 growth concept map. Specific conditions in Metro Ordinance 41040B required that should the selected right-of-way for the connector follow the approximate course of the south alignment, then the portion of the Tualatin area north of the right-of-way would be designated outdoor neighborhood for residential development on the growth concept map. An outer neighborhood is primarily residential and is distinguished from the slightly more compact inner neighborhood with somewhat larger lots and fewer street connections. The south portion of the connector, which was the portion south of the connector, which was the area within Wilsonville, was required to be designated industrial, without the same exception as the Tualatin portion. Thus, Wilsonville's part of the planning area has always been intended for industrial use. Some other considerations for using land in Basalt Creek for residential or industrial use are shown on this slide. At the time of Title 11 concept planning, Tualatin had limited area for residential expansion, with Basalt Creek being adjacent to existing residential areas to the north and Tualatin's industrial areas concentrated in other parts of the city, in the central and western parts. Extending residential use to the south into the planning area seemed to make sense, despite the area being designated for industrial use. By contrast, Wilsonville's had limited area for industrial expansion, and Basalt Creek was adjacent to existing industrial and commercial areas to the south. Residential land use was concentrated in the southern part of the city. Thus, it was logical that the part of Basalt Creek planning area within Wilsonville would be designated for industrial use. At the February 12th work session, some questions also came up about allowed use of Title IV employment land as regulated by the Urban Growth Management Functional Plan. The map on this slide is an excerpt of the Title IV Industrial and Other Employment Areas map showing Wilsonville and the Basalt Creek planning area. Basalt Creek, similar to other industrial areas in the city other than Coffee Creek, is designated industrial area on the Title IV map. Industrial areas are not necessarily located near the most important regional transportation connections, which is the case for RSIA, such as Coffee Creek, but similar to RSIA areas, industrial areas have protections against certain types of non-industrial uses and for efficient movement of freight. Employment areas include a mix of employment uses. These areas may feature higher concentrations of office and retail businesses, with retail businesses primarily serving workers nearby. And this distinguishes employment areas from neighborhood business districts and other commercial areas that serve both residents and visitors. Title IV provides for and protects the supply of sites for industrial use by limiting the types and scale of non-industrial uses in both RSIA and industrial areas. It also provides benefits of clustering to industries that operate more productively and efficiently when in proximity to each other, as well as protects the capacity and efficiency of the transportation system for movement of goods and services, and encourages other types of employment to occur in centers, corridors, station communities, and main streets. With regard to protection of industrial areas, cities and counties are required to include measures to limit new buildings for retail commercial uses, such as stores and restaurants, and retail and professional services that cater to daily customers, such as financial, insurance, real estate, legal, medical, and dental offices. This is to ensure that uses serve primarily the needs of workers in the area. One of the measures limits the amount of building occupied by stores, branches, agencies, or other outlets to no more than 5,000 square feet of sales or service area in a single outlet, or 20,000 square feet in multiple outlets within a site. With regard to regionally significant industrial areas, Title IV prohibits siting of schools, places of assembly larger than 20,000 square feet, or parks intended to serve people other than those that are working or residing in the RSIA. By comparison, protection of industrial areas does not include those limitations. Consistent with the Urban Growth Management Functional Plan, Wilsonville's PDI and the PDI RSIA zoning regulations include the required limitations on those types of uses. So consistent with Metro Ordinance number 41040B and Title IV of the Urban Growth Management Functional Plan, Wilsonville portion of Basalt Creek is intended for various intensities of urban industrial development. As discussed in previous work sessions, the concept plan designates 3 industrial land use types, which are the high-tech employment, the light industrial, and the craft industrial. One other element of the regulatory context of land use planning in the metro area is urban and rural reserves, which are outside of the urban growth boundary. Urban reserves, shown in blue on the map, are land suitable for accommodating urban development over the 50 years since their designation, which was in 2011. There are several urban reserves bordering Wilsonville that are intended for a range of uses. For instance, Area 4F, which is Ellickson Road North, located northeast of the city, is primarily a rural residential. It's currently in rural and agricultural use right now. It has some potential for employment uses near the Ellickson interchange, but is probably most suitable for residential use in the rest of the area. Similarly, Area 4G, which is Ellickson Road South, could accommodate a mix of residential and employment needs. By comparison, Area 5F, which is Tonkin, is currently being used for quarry operations, and any reuse of that area will likely be well in the future once operations have ceased. There is limited potential in any of these urban reserve areas to significantly increase the city's supply of industrial land. This makes limiting land use in Basalt Creek to industrial critical to ensuring that local and regional industrial land needs are met into the future. And that's even more important because of Tualatin's use of their portion of the area for residential, which substantially reduces the land that's available for industrial use, both locally and regionally. And I think at this point, I want to pause and take a few minutes to give Planning Commission an opportunity to ask questions or provide input about the regulatory context information.
Thank you for that. I'll look to my commissioners to see if you have any reactions or questions for the city team on those. Okay, kick us off.
So it sounds like the definition of industrial is, I guess preventing isn't the right word, but it's strongly against things that are retail or consumer-based. So-
It does limit those, yes.
So is that, because like, does a medical office fit into that definition? Where does a medical office fit?
So we will be having more conversation about this, I think, in the future, but in short, the type of medical office varies. So, right, if you're looking at like a clinic that has kind of constant come and go. Traffic versus something that's more research center or like or like a, what's the word I'm looking for? Inpatient facility that has less coming and going and a high employment count could kind of meet the intent.
Okay.
Good question.
Commissioner Willard, did you?
I mostly wanted to thank the staff for bringing this information. I feel like this is very helpful to us understand the context of when it came into the urban growth boundary and what those limitations are, and why Tualatin is different. And so this has been very helpful. Thank you.
Something else? Yeah, I would just echo what Commissioner Willard said. I appreciate the context. And I was looking in the packet, maybe this gets more into the vacancy conversation, so maybe we can come back to it. But there was something referencing that only a small percentage of industrial space in Wilsonville has been developed. So there's a lot more that needs to be developed. Does that include this planned area, or does that just, is this planned area separate from that? The inventory, yeah, thank you. And it was like less than 2%, I think, of industrial. And I can look up the page number too. Give me 1 second. So it said only 1.7% of total industrial space has been built in the last 10 years compared to 11% in the broader Portland metro area. So I guess I'm just trying to understand, like, when we talk about the urban reserves and we don't have, room to build industrial there, but we still have all of this available space that still needs to be built out because only 1% has been. I don't know. I guess this is more just commentary or
Is it okay
something
if
to
I jump
notice.
in?
Yeah.
Thanks. I'm babbling. Stop me.
No, not at all. I think what's going on is maybe just some confusing language. I think what the intent of that statement is to say that development in Wilsonville only accounts for a very small percentage of total industrial development in the greater metro market.
Got it.
And I don't know that was clear. So it's not necessarily saying that only 1% of Wilsonville's industrial land has been developed. That's far from true.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's also the same timeline that a lot of our industrial stock is getting older.
Okay.
A lot of it was built in the 90s, 80s. So.
Thanks for clarifying. Oh, yeah, go for it.
I appreciate the context so much too. That was very helpful. When you say City of Wilsonville is being required, is that by Metro? Who's the entity that's requiring City of Wilsonville to provide this?
Oh, to use it as industrial land?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's kind of inherent in it in that it was designated as that on the Title IV map. And so we're working within that context of Metro designating it for that, and it therefore being intended for or required to be used for industrial. Yeah.
Commissioner Semenova, if I may add a little bit of additional context, is that as you know, with like the Housing Our Future work, we're doing our current housing needs and capacity analysis, and as part of that, we look at a 20-year need for growth for housing, right? And we similarly have an employment opportunity analysis to look at, well, what's the demand for employment growth in the city of Wilsonville over the next 20 years? That 20-year planning horizon is essentially the state kind of mandated planning horizon for all of us to be planning for jobs and housing and our urban growth boundaries. And if we don't have enough land to accommodate for those needs for both jobs and housing, then cities are to look for additional land or capacity within their current urban growth boundary in order to accommodate that need. In the Portland metro area, we uniquely have an additional layer, which is the region, the metro region. And that came about because it was originally a council of governments all working together in order to look at a metro-wide urban growth boundary or to coordinate amongst one another. It was very difficult with all of the different cities. And a lot of data analysis that honestly at the time was very difficult to do. We didn't have a lot of what we have today to help us with this data analysis. So essentially out of that was formed the metro regional government. Metro does the same analysis, just on different timeframes than us, looking at land outside of the current urban growth boundary to see, do we have a demand that's higher than the land we have on either the employment side or the residential side. They do a report every 6 years, and out of that report, they look at whether they need to add land to the urban growth boundary. And so when this land was brought in, it was intentionally brought in because there was a shortage of industrial acreage in the metro region. And so when they brought it in, they also designated it as Title IV land to ensure that it would be actually protected for industrial use and not be developed as commercial use. So, because especially it was around the same time that Title IV actually was coming together, and a lot of the restrictions were put in place because of a lot of industrial land in the region was actually converting to like large big box retail, or because a Title IV placement hadn't put on it that it would develop into subdivisions because residential carries a higher like revenue stream, higher price tag. So there were a lot of different reasons, but essentially Title IV was developed in order to maintain large lots and reduce the impact of commercial developing in those areas. So the answer to that is like, yes, and it's because now Metro, every urban growth report that's been done since this land was brought in, when they do the assessment, they use the premise that this area is going to develop with industrial or employment and a certain job density for it. And so then when they are making a determination on whether they need to bring in additional land for industrial purposes, it's based on that prior land use that's already been assigned. That was a really long-winded answer, but I wanted to give some context for Metro because we don't often actually interact with their regulations all that often. And so when we do, like kind of having some of that backstory, I thought might be helpful.
It is very helpful. I like to understand the why, and that context is extremely helpful. Thank you. Commissioner Carr, do you?
I have two questions. One is, does Metro have enforcement permission, or is it everybody plays together well? Or, well, I'm being nice.
Yeah. The preference for Metro is always that they don't have to use enforcement, like any of us, right? We don't really want to go out and do enforcement. However, they do have the capability to enforce. Every year, they do an assessment of whether cities are in compliance with every single chapter of their functional plan. Our report in January of 2025 is that we are in compliance with the Metro Urban Growth Management Functional Plan. If we were to come out of compliance, it's up to them to choose what path they'd like to take for enforcement. It would probably, if we were taking a legislative action, they could take us to LUBA, go through the path of saying we weren't following essentially requirements put on us by the state land use planning system, which includes compliance with Metro. I do know that like as a jurisdiction, I don't know all the ins and outs of this, but like because like the way tax revenue works and we get a part of like money from the region, they can also withhold money that the city receives through that process. So there is also a potential like fiscal impact, and I'm not as clear on exactly what that is, but.
And then the second question relates to the fact that this has been in place for 20 plus years. Do the contractor lots fit within the definition of industrial? And if not, how did they get there? And are we out of compliance?
No, because it's not within the city of Wilsonville. So
Not yet.
oftentimes, like a contractor's establishment could be seen as an industrial type activity, like as a land use. It would not fall within like what Metro is expecting in terms of future urbanized employment growth. But because this land is still in the county, really there is not like an enforcement mechanism on us in terms of development or
So
performance.
Metro can't go back to Washington County and say, you haven't been playing by the rules?
Probably not, because they knew at the time that this land was brought in what the FD20 zoning was.
Thank you.
All right, I think we can move on to the next one.
Thank you. So again, by way of introduction, my name is Matt Lorenzen. I'm the city's economic development manager. I don't know that I've interacted with this commission yet. I've been on staff for 3 years. So glad to have the opportunity to meet you all tonight. Commissioner Carr and I have interacted on the Urban Renewal Task Force and in conjunction with town center related stuff, but it's the first time I get to be here, so appreciate the opportunity. My job duties are diverse, but if there's a common thread that runs through all of those responsibilities, it's really about strengthening and growing the tax base. And so when we think about land use planning, especially for employment uses, that is not residential uses, there's big revenue implications for the city's revenues and the city budget. And so Cindy did a great job of really framing this conversation. This area there have been long-standing policy decisions made, dating way back, that designate this land for employment, specifically industrial use. So what we need to do now as we move through this Willer exercise is to understand what is the market demand and what will benefit the city the most. Its residents and its workforce that come in here on a daily basis. So with all of that in mind, I'd like to lead you through some information that I think may have already been presented, but it's, I think, helpful to review it again, especially in light of the context of what Cindy has shared tonight. So as you're very well aware, as many people are aware, Wilsonville has a very strong industrial employment base. In 2022, the city had over 21,000 jobs, and that's for covered employees, and covered refers to employees that are covered by unemployment insurance. And so if you add to that non-covered employees, so that would be independent contractors, federal employees, a few other categories, agricultural workers. The workforce in Wilsonville is closer to 23,000 with more recent data. Our strongest sectors are manufacturing, wholesale trade, warehousing and distribution, and construction. That makes up 43% of the city's total employment, and that's a much higher share compared to the broader metro area, which is about 22% for those same sectors. So this focus on industrial jobs sets Wilsonville apart and helps us to better understand Wilsonville's role in the greater regional economy. This is a Wilsonville conversation, but it is within a regional context, and important to keep that in mind.
Oops. Keeps going the wrong way.
Over the past decade, Wilsonville's employment has grown by 18%, or 3,335 covered jobs, and that's slightly faster than the greater area, which experienced 17% growth. Wilsonville's job growth was largely driven by an increase in construction jobs. So we've seen several large contracting companies come into the city. Probably the most visible is I&E Construction on I-5 there. The payroll for those employees is coming through Wilsonville. Most of those employees are working all throughout the region building stuff. But those are considered Wilsonville jobs. Although the Tri-County region has experienced growth in construction jobs, Wilsonville's rate of growth was considerably higher. We've also had strong employment growth in administration, waste management, wholesale trade, which again would include distribution and warehousing, and other professional services. While wholesale employment rose in Wilsonville, it actually declined across the broader region. During the same period, Wilsonville maintained stable employment in transportation and warehousing, while the greater region grew substantially. So just some small nuances there. Taking a look at the office market, and this, we're going to move through this, I think, pretty quickly. It's still important to take into account. When the concept plan was developed for Basalt Creek, I think there was assumptions made that there would be a lot more office use within this area because that was where the economy was. Things have changed very significantly in the interim. And so as we look at forecasting into the future, especially for land use purposes, important to have office allowed for some degree of use within future development, but certainly not at the same magnitude that was expected previously. So just reviewing the greater office market, the Portland metro area has had, as you probably know, if you've been paying attention, very high vacancy rates as of late. Negative net absorption, which basically just means vacancy. People moving out rather than moving in, and overall low leasing activity. But the regional office market is not uniform, and the suburbs have actually performed pretty well compared to downtown. Suburbs like Wilsonville have, in some cases, seen benefits from some of the challenges that Portland has faced. Companies are seeking a more hospitable environment to do business, and so they're looking at suburban office complexes rather than downtown. Wilsonville does have lower vacancy rates than the greater region, and rents have increased over time. However, we haven't completely escaped this pattern of negative net absorption as companies reevaluate their need for office space. So while Wilsonville's office vacancy rate has generally been lower than the broader regions, the end of a few large leases are reflected in the spikes you see in this graph. These spikes reflect the fact that Wilsonville is a relatively small market, and a few vacancies can translate into big blips on a graph like this. Coming to mind offhand is, for example, the Peyton Business Center. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that property, but it faces I-5. It was most recently occupied by the state of Oregon, where they were processing unemployment claims during the pandemic. That lease has ended, and so that's one of these spikes that you see on here. That's an example of 122,000 feet that suddenly doesn't have anyone occupying it, and it's reflected in the data. Office rents have increased in...
Let me just interrupt you real quick. On that
Please.
prior graph, it does look like those are temporary, though, those vacancies by this graph.
Right. Peyton, as of today, is vacant, but yeah, generally speaking, you'll have a period of vacancy and it will lease up again.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, speaking to rents, they've increased across the submarket, this I-5 South submarket, which I think you've probably defined in previous meetings, but like Tigard to Tualatin, Sherwood, Wilsonville is what that I-5 South submarket is. Despite high vacancies, rents remain substantially above the Portland metro region's average. And again, we're talking about office. Since the initial decline in 2020, rents in Wilsonville have risen steadily and are now about equal to the Portland metro average. So want to pivot back to industrial, because that's really where our focus is. Generally speaking, the industrial market in Wilsonville and that of the Portland region, our circumstances align relatively well with the national trends. The Portland metro had strong industrial growth between 2021 and 2023 and remains strong, but that growth is decelerating. Some of that growth was driven by demand for specifically warehousing and distribution space during the pandemic when online retail really spiked. Investors and leasing professionals are confident in the regional market's long-term health, particularly due to significant investments in the region's semiconductor manufacturing sector. And the region has also benefited from other federal investments, including the Inflation Reduction Act and some lingering impacts from ARPA, the American Rescue Plan, and other pandemic-era investments. Generally speaking, strong industrial market, low vacancy rates, increasing rents. That's kind of the gist of it. We foresee this trend will continue into the future, but Wilsonville's shortage of development-ready industrial land and large parcels is something we broadly recognize, and this observation, which the data bears out, was also confirmed repeatedly in some of the stakeholder interviews we've done with the development community, brokers from the area, and so forth. There's pent-up demand for development-ready industrial land in the region, and specifically the Wilsonville, Tualatin, Sherwood submarket. Let's go to the next slide. Wilsonville's vacancy rate has remained below 6% for most of the past decade. In 2020 and 2021, Wilsonville saw a brief spike in vacancy, likely driven by the pandemic, but recovered quickly. As of the latest data, our vacancy rate in the city is 2.6%, which is lower than the surrounding region. As far as rents, industrial rents in Wilsonville have generally increased over the past decade, despite a drop in 2020 and 2021. As of July 2024, industrial rents are higher in Wilsonville than comparison regions. This combination of rising rents and a very low vacancy rate suggests a robust industrial market in Wilsonville, which is potentially attractive to new development and especially speculative development. In other words, they can build speculatively with a high assurance that there's going to be someone to occupy that property once it's built. I will go to the next slide. Industrial development along the I-5 South submarket, as I just defined it, has recently concentrated in Tualatin and Sherwood, primarily because they've got land ready to go. With Wilsonville falling behind, likely due to our lack of development-ready land. So not lack of land, but lack of development-ready land, an important distinction. Many spec developers are seeking large sites, as demonstrated by recent developments in Sherwood and Tualatin on parcels that exceed 10 acres. Local developers report that most of the industrial demand is coming from existing regional businesses rather than out-of-state companies. These local industrial users are primarily looking to expand or upgrade their current facilities within the area. Many express a desire to be outside the city of Portland and Multnomah County, citing concerns about public safety and higher rates of taxation. And I can say that that is true just from many of the informal conversations I have as well with people that call my phone line looking for space. If they don't have a broker, they'll call me and ask what's available. And in many cases, it's Portland companies that are looking at their alternatives as their leases come up for renewal. Overall, Basalt Creek's long-standing vision as an industrial area, which Cindy spoke to, aligns well with current market trends, which show strong demand for industrial space, both nationally and in the Portland metro region. So with that, questions about where the market is at and where the demand is at. I'd be happy to take those before Cindy continues.
I don't have a question, more a comment that I really wish that the rest of our citizens could understand this data like we're getting to understand it tonight, because I think there's a perception that the vacancies are much higher than they are. And this is very surprising. I think either people are seeing the vacant retail space and just extending that, or it just doesn't drive as much traffic issues, because we would be aware of it if there were traffic problems.
Yeah.
But, so anyway, this is surprising in a good way, and I wish more people were aware of these vacancy numbers.
Yeah, and some of the vacancies that have occurred in the most recent past are large and visible. And so I think that leads people to draw this conclusion, well, it applies everywhere. So I mentioned Peyton, it's visible from I-5. Another was the Rite Aid Distribution Center. There were headlines about that it's now been leased up and it's occupied again. So, yeah, there are these blips on the graph, but to your point, in a submarket like Wilsonville that's so well positioned geographically and from a transportation access standpoint, generally speaking, unless there's really extenuating circumstances, those vacancies don't last very long for industrial users.
Go for it.
Mine relates to the size of lot that the market's looking for is 10, you said 10 plus acres. So what percentage of this industrial available land fits that description of 10 plus acres?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I would put an asterisk next to the 10 acres. I think for spec developers, that 10 acre threshold is probably pretty solid. For what I would call an owner occupied user, like a Precision Countertops, that number is much more flexible and could come down significantly, only needing maybe a few acres, for example. So, but back to your bigger question, which is how much of Basalt Creek fits within that 10 acre or higher category. It depends. Some of it has been aggregated and by people who are waiting in the wings for Wilsonville to be ready to take a development application. And so there are instances where there are larger sites ready to go that are well above that 10 acre threshold. For the balance of the area, with the exception of, well, I think you're going to talk about the Green Hill site later in the presentation.
Not a lot.
Okay, well, closer to I-5, there's another site that is under single ownership, not by a development company, but just by the legacy owner that's been there for a long, long time. That would also be well above that 10 acre threshold. The balance of the planning area is similar to Coffee Creek in the sense that it's kind of divided up in wonky ways and for the most part under that 10 acre threshold. So it is an obstacle. I think that's been discussed in previous sessions and will continue to be something that we think about as we move into later in 2025 and into 2025 and think about policy decisions and recommendations to the city council for how something like parcelized property can be overcome to facilitate development.
Follow-up question is, Tualatin and Sherwood have had a lot of development. How much land do they have left? So, because that's what we're competing with, right, is those?
Yeah, I'm not in a great position to speak to their specific inventories. What I do know is that there's a shared inhibitor in all of these communities, and that's largely infrastructure. So even where opportunities exist, that continues to be an obstacle. But where aggregation is possible, sometimes that infrastructure hurdle can be overcome because the economics begin to make sense. When you have smaller development sites, the cost of extending infrastructure, the economics just don't work out. So sorry if I'm going off on a tangent, but I can't speak to the inventory of those other communities, but
they have similar constraints to what we have.
Yes, yeah, we're not unique in that regard.
Okay. And just a final comment, my employer left the city of Portland and moved out to a suburb.
Okay.
That was 400 employees, so I know exactly why.
Yeah.
But I hear that again and again. And you just have to read the Portland newspaper to hear about companies that are vacating Portland and moving to the suburbs. So.
Yeah, I think we believe very much so in regionalism and understand that we succeed and fail to some degree together with Portland and our surrounding communities. At the same time, we'll take the wins where we can get them, right?
Right.
Thank you.
Commissioner Sabanova, did you have anything? I really appreciated that question because I was thinking along the same lines of how much of the land is 10 plus acres to make us more competitive, but it does sound like it's more of infrastructure is a higher priority in terms of being more competitive. Is that right?
Certainly. I mean, if if there was a scenario,
Or development.
we're just
Yeah, thank you.
playing make-believe right now, where both like underground pipes and transportation infrastructure were all built out, and you had utilities stubbed at the curb all around this planning area, it would be probably developed yesterday.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. All right, I think we can keep moving on. Thank you.
Well, and also I was going to say that I think one of our biggest impediments here in Wilsonville is just that this land isn't zoned yet by us.
Sure.
So, you know, and it has to be zoned before they can actually annex it. So, you know, that's one of the big ones.
Yeah, and sorry to prolong the conversation, but development occurs along the path of least resistance. And Coffee Creek, for example, we've seen development occur there, but there are obstacles. We're going to see in Basalt Creek as well that development will occur where there's a path of least resistance and the opportunity is ripe, and we're going to see other areas that are more challenging that will, I don't want to say languish, but they're going to be slower to develop.
All right. So we did want to spend a few minutes talking about market-driven versus aspirational choices when it comes to land use and land use planning, because I know that came up in our conversation last month as well. So I just was going to give a kind of an overview of, I think it's pretty obvious market-driven land use, refers to a pattern where the allocation and development of land is primarily determined by market forces, meaning decisions about how to use the land are largely based on things like profit potential, property values, demand from the market, rather than solely by government regulation and community planning efforts. Market-driven land use is influenced by the supply of available land and the demand for specific types of development, with developers often choosing locations that offer the highest potential for return on investment. When land use choices are market-driven, policies like zoning regulations can help incentivize certain types of development in specific areas, thus shaping the land use based on market dynamics. And while market-driven land use can promote economic growth, it can also lead to issues. Things like urban sprawl or environmental deregulation, if it's not carefully managed. It tends to be somewhat of a shorter-sighted approach as it responds to recent history and current conditions of the market rather than projecting into the long-term future and accommodating possible shifts in that demand. On the other hand, aspirational land use refers to a desired future land use pattern that a community aims to achieve that often reflects a vision of more sustainable, equitable, and desirable development. This might include such elements as mixed-use zoning, increased green spaces, improved connectivity, going beyond the current land use and market conditions to think about what could happen in an area. It's more future-oriented, describing land use that a community actively strives to implement. And it's also idealistic in that it incorporates elements that are considered socially, environmentally, and economically beneficial, even if they might require significant changes to existing zoning or development patterns to achieve. While this approach understands and responds to the current market conditions, it isn't limited by them. Rather, it looks towards the future with a goal-directed and longer-sighted focus to aim for what could be. And I did want to go over just briefly the concept plan and the guiding principles that were in the concept plan. This is a lot of text, but it considered industrial land demand and market conditions, but the guiding principles tended more toward being aspirational in nature. And I listed them on the slide here, and just very briefly, they included things like maintaining and complementing Wilsonville's unique identity, capitalizing on the area's unique assets and natural location, exploring creative approaches to integrate jobs and housing in the craft industrial land use type, creating a uniquely attractive business community unmatched in the metropolitan region, ensuring appropriate transitions between land uses, meeting regional responsibility for jobs, designing cohesive and efficient transportation and utility systems, maximizing assessed property value, and incorporating natural resource areas and providing recreational opportunities as community amenities and assets. And with that, we wanted to just take a few minutes to talk about, I mean, you had questions about the market aspects, but thinking about when it comes to the choices that we're making in Basalt Creek, and keeping in mind those concept plan guiding principles, where does Planning Commission kind of fall on that scale between market-driven on one hand and aspirational on the other, as guidance and direction for us as we move further along in the planning aspects for Basalt Creek?
Start over here, Commissioner Semenova.
I lean towards the aspirational, but sometimes that comes with a high cost, and I want to be mindful and cognizant of what kind of financial impact it is to the residents or people that live in Wilsonville in developing the infrastructure and anything else. There's got to be a good balance of that.
Commissioner Carr?
I agree with Commissioner Semenova in that aspirational is where that's our target, but we can't do that outside of where the market is and where the market will be, and that's the challenge. Obviously, it's not always build it and they'll come. In some cases, you do have to adhere to what the future market will be and design the plan around that. I think what we've done, especially knowing that the Tualatin area is more residential, the fact that we are going from their residential to a light industrial to a more heavy industrial or just industrial, I think that gives us that blend from residential to industrial. I think the high-tech area is well defined. I'm just concerned what will fit in there as far as actual businesses and what type of businesses we're trying to attract in there. Also knowing that the industrial, especially on the western side, has to be aware of the natural resources and the impact to the area because of that. So we can't have a big smelting plant, right? Because of proximity to water. So I think the plan has done well with those things in mind. My fear is, okay, we've got buckets to put things in. Now what are we actually filling the buckets with? But I like the plan.
Commissioner Willett?
With the context that we've had and then what was provided in the packet, I'm leaning more towards the aspirational now. I think it's a big part of the planning art to be aspirational. I think I liked what what Mr. Pauly said last time about the craft industrial and allowing the owners there some choice. I like allowing landowners choice. The one that I'm a little bit less aspirational on is the West Railroad because of its severe constraints. And if we're not going to actively remove the railroad constraint in particular, then I think that one we're going to be allowing the market to dictate. So that would be my one exception there is on that property.
Well, I think that's a fundamental question of what we do from the Planning Commission. It's to design the city as we would like it to be. And I like that it's not market-driven completely. I mean, we hear some pretty sobering numbers that there's some demand out there, but what do we want from our city? What do we want it to look like? Many other communities let developers and businesses decide what we're going to look like. We have one chance. And I think our job is easier than, for example, the city council that has to weigh in all of those issues about tax revenue and budgets. And boy, we're focused squarely on what do we want our city to look like. And our role is focused so squarely on that. So I sure like trying to make the balance, but the aspirational aspects of this is key. We have one chance. This is undeveloped, but it's kind of exciting to be able to figure out what we want. Anyways, some thoughts.
Yeah, I think going off of that, and similar to what you said, just the additional context of like what has already been done in terms of Metro having a say, what does the region need, right? Those are all kind of more of that, more market-driven kind of like, what does the region need versus our role can be a little bit more like push the other way, so that balance is needed. So, yeah.
All right. Very helpful, thank you. Yes.
Just a quick note from the economic development perspective. I was mentioning Coffee Creek and some of the hurdles and obstacles there, and that many of those will exist in Basalt Creek as well. Commissioner Willard, I think your thinking is sound in that there are places where you can be more aspirational and places where you might have to concede a little bit more and strike that balance. Or, if we're not looking at the whole area as a monolith, how can we be strategic and targeted in where we want to be aspirational, and where are the places where we need to not create more obstacles, but indeed let the market dynamic do its thing. So that's just my thought there. I'm oftentimes envious, at least in some ways. In other states, there are large economic development authorities that act as developers in many regards, buy massive tracts of land and install infrastructure, and they can be incredibly aspirational about what they put there because it's ready to go and they've done the hard work and the heavy lifting and made those investments. That's not what the reality we have here. We have highly parcelized properties that all have nuances and different, in some cases, users that have been there for a long time. There's just all these different considerations. So I think just the question I would leave you with is, where can we be aspirational, and where would being aspirational actually lead us to an outcome where the property just languishes in perpetuity because we've been maybe a little bit too far down on that side of the spectrum.
And I would say I appreciate this conversation. I'd add from my perspective, I mean, I've been here a while, but also during that time I've overlapped with some employees that have been here since forever. So, and learned a lot from them. And so kind of learned the kind of that culture, that development culture here. And I think what you're saying is reflective of what we've done over the preceding decades. Is, sometimes we do push the level, we don't, we wait until things are fixed the right way, both in terms of infrastructure and getting the development that is needed and that's desired. And we really see that in our built environment, and that's really appreciated by residents and the business community. And sometimes that has taken a backbone, right? For sure. But I do think at the same time, throughout that history, we have been noticed where things, while thinking long-term, we also, we're dealing with a market. And so it's a balance, and I appreciate your comments on balance. But thinking, not thinking about immediate returns, but thinking that this built environment will be there for a long time. We think about built environments, example that's been used a lot is like tree groves have gone through like 3 cycles of development around them, and just always thinking about that long term. So.
Commissioner Carr, did you?
Yeah,
Got there?
I think the Basalt Creek planning area recognized the larger constraints on the west region by basically saying, we'll figure that out later. And I think infrastructure is probably the largest constraint for that area, because we want to make it industrial, meaning we want trucks, right? If we're going to be honest, industrial usually means trucks, right? And the railroad bridge is, the railroad overpass or whatever we want to call it, is a massive constraint for that area. And that's not an easy fix, and that involves more than Wilsonville and counties, and so that's a much larger, longer putt. So, but yeah.
That just reminds me, so last time we were talking about further just analysis of the West Railroad area. When will we, is that for months from now, or when are we expecting to get more information on that?
It's coming soon.
Okay. Okay, I'm just curious.
Can we move all the contractor establishments in the other part of Basalt Creek over there for now?
I wish we could just hook them up to a trailer and do that, but.
Pick them up and move them. And, yeah.
I had one other small thought. I apologize.
Go for it.
One of the things that I discussed during the data section here about market dynamics is a lot of the demand that exists is for speculative development, right? We don't have like Intel or other owner users that are doing self-development, like beating down the door. A lot of the demand is for speculative projects, for you're going to have a facility built that's going to accommodate multiple tenants in some cases and within one building. So again, just want to have you keep that in mind as well when we start thinking about in future months use categories and things like that. Flexibility is important in order to be able to ensure that properties that get built can also be occupied. If the number of users and uses is too small, then we inhibit the ability of a speculative project to come to fruition and pencil out in the long term or in the short term.
But we still have to play by the industrial guideline rules.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that we go bonkers, but
we can't have a bouncy house business in the middle of the industrial section. So, yeah.
But to the spirit of flexibility, I think we really need to monitor what's going to happen with the manufacturing park on the Tualatin side, because it will likely draw other businesses to be adjacent to the manufacturing park. And so we should be understanding with the pace of that and the health of those planning processes, so we can take advantage of it.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and appreciate the point about flexibility. I see head nods when you say that, so I think, yeah.
The reality is it's a very delicate game of balance.
Yeah.
So have fun.
Thanks.
All right. So our last set of slides talks about the couple of land use types. So we're going to focus in on the high-tech employment and the light industrial. And we are going to have, future work sessions will focus on the craft industrial as well as West Railroad. So I did include, these will probably look pretty familiar. We just have here some examples of the high-tech employment, and it was envisioned, as you're aware, to include high-tech single users or, accompanied by manufacturing, some warehouse space. It was assumed to be roughly half office and half industrial, although that probably will shift some based on the information from the economic inventory and market analysis. Let's see, where are we going? The size or the stories of the building, so it was seen as 1 to 2 story, but then also providing some opportunity for 4 to 5 story if it was more office oriented or corporate headquarters kind of development. And let's see what else we have here for it. And then one reason why there was such a large area that was designated for high-tech employment did have to do with a couple of things. One was wanting to have some design consistency with properties on the south side of Day Road that are in the Coffee Creek area and under the Industrial Design Overlay District. It was envisioned to be an extension almost of that Coffee Creek area where you have a modern industrial district that has cohesive, high-quality site, landscape, and building design that's integrated with adjacent streetscapes and public spaces and supports multimodal transportation and creates a pleasant and functional district for employees and visitors. Let's see. And I did include some pictures, some slides and renderings of the 4 developments that have occurred in Coffee Creek as examples of what you might see in the Industrial Design Overlay District. So that's Delta Logistics and the Aries development, as well as Coffee Creek Logistics, and then Precision Countertops is at the bottom on here. And then for the light industrial, there's some examples here on the slide. That was modeled to include primarily manufacturing and warehouses in single or multi-tenant buildings with some office and commercial activities. Employment was assumed to be roughly 70% industrial, with the remainder split between warehousing and office. You see a lot of similar development, I think, throughout Wilsonville in our industrial parks, our business parks. And the market analysis noted that an approach to supporting a wide range of industrial and office uses consistent with the concept plan and the economic inventory would be desirable for this area, for the light industrial. And that could, while allowing the market to determine kind of the most appropriate locations for the various business types, it would still prioritize industries that are aligned with the city's employment and wage goals. And then we did want to talk a bit about what we refer to as the Grams Ferry assemblage site. It is these parcels where there were several parcels before have been all purchased by the same owner. The box, the square that's in orange there is actually under negotiation for acquisition by the same owner. It includes 5 tax lots that are under one ownership, plus the additional one that's under negotiation. There's roughly 44 acres, with approximately 25 acres designated light industrial and the remainder 19 acres designated high tech. And so we wanted to talk a bit about, should it really, since it's under one ownership, likely should be in one district? And if so, what your thoughts are about which one would be more appropriate for that area. Let's see. And so I think that brings us to some questions. I did want to point out or clarify that, so we have the difference between the zoning and what might be applied out there and these sub-districts, and how do those interface with each other? Because the city only has, well, we have 2 industrial zoning districts. We have the PDI and we have PDI RSIA. In all likelihood, the bulk of the Basalt Creek area will land in PDI. But there may be, within that, perhaps some uses that we would want to, within the zoning, we could have some sub-district specifics about the sub-districts. So, for instance, if in high-tech employment, there were certain uses that we might want to avoid or discourage in that area. For instance, like land extensive uses like call centers or distribution and logistics or warehousing, things that would be a lower number of jobs and taking up more land. So as we're thinking toward what zoning will be applied here, this first question gets to that of within these different sub-districts, are there uses that we might want to discourage so that we could accomplish the vision for those different land use types? And then also, you know, are the boundaries of them appropriate in your mind? And then also specific about the Grams Ferry assemblage and what we should do about it being split between two of those districts.
Cindy, do you have anything else? And we didn't talk about this beforehand, but you may know off the top of your head. Why particularly, like, why different areas were assigned those high-tech versus light industrial, especially where the light industrial is primarily outside of the Grams Ferry assemblage, that north of Clay?
So my understanding is that the high-tech, and Miranda can pipe in here, if I'm not getting it completely right. I do know that I believe it had to do quite a bit with trips and trip generation, and that the high-tech employment district would have the highest density of employment, of jobs. And there was a desire to attempt to balance the number of trips that there would be in Wilsonville and the number of trips that there would be in Tualatin, which with residential would be generating quite a few. And so, you know, that resulted in that district being extended more and covering more area within Basalt Creek. And also, I think from a design aspect, the desire to have consistent design on both sides of Day Road. Yeah, I don't know if there's more that Miranda
That
wants
was
to add.
a great summary. Cindy is turning to me in some regards because I was the project manager for the Basalt Creek concept plan and was involved in every discussion for that. So I would say the only additional context that I would add is part of it was, especially at the time, a desire to have higher density employment opportunities in this area if possible. Having a recognition that really outside of this urban reserve, there's really only one other urban reserve kind of in the future for the city of Wilsonville that will likely involve some employment. Most of our urban reserve areas will likely be primarily residential, even though, as you know, we like to have whole communities, and so there's always some element of commercial, and the areas near Ellickson Road, especially to the north of Argyle, might have some employment, but really, you know, we have a strong industrial base as a city, and it's always been kind of important in terms of our financial well-being as well as well-being for our employees to have a lot of great job opportunities. So that was a part of the discussion as well. We brought kind of these, they started out as just prototypes that staff pulled together based on existing employment that was in the city that the council really liked. And so we kind of pulled those together based on their feedback. And then that did evolve in terms of it would be great to have that by I-5 on the flat parcels at Green Hill, and then it kind of evolved into having additional employment density in this area would be really important. And then that extension along Day Road, as Cindy mentioned, in terms of really reflecting the same type of development to the south and to the north of Day Road. That being said, in the Coffee Creek industrial area, excuse me, that area didn't necessarily call specifically for high-tech, and it's really more, it's got that design overlay, but it didn't necessarily say this is the type of employment we want to focus on. It was, during the planning for Basalt Creek, there was some discussion of, we already have a lot of that high-tech industry in Wilsonville, and we feel like we could attract more, especially like kind of supporting businesses to some of those larger tech industries. And so that was a part of the dialogue. I don't know that they envisioned that like everything that went in that, on every parcel in that entire area that's high tech would necessarily be like a tech company. I think it was more those types of companies, that type of design of development, and making sure that we provided space for it within Basalt Creek. But I probably went too much into the weeds on that one, but I've been around a while now, so I have a lot of context.
Yeah, and one other, just specifically talking about Day Road, is uses outside. We've talked quite a bit about contractors' establishment and that those may be longer to redevelop, and so that's consumed some of the land, at least for some period, that would be high tech. But in addition to that, there's kind of a key parcel there along Day Road that has subsequently been developed as a substation or expansion of the substation.
Also, since I'm in the business of context tonight, one other missing piece that I haven't covered yet that goes back to Commissioner Semenova's question about Metro and employment and industrial is it was kind of unique in this situation that this land was brought in for two cities to concept plan for. And so knowing it was going to be primarily industrial, but with some residential on the north end, the transportation system was actually planned first. So you often go through concept planning, and as a part of that, you're determining, well, what transportation infrastructure system do we need in order to support that land use? And we kind of just went in it assuming, okay, we know it's going to be primarily employment industrial, so let's assume kind of a trip generation for the planning area. Also knowing the regional industrial system it connects with on the entire Washington County, South County industrial area. There's multiple industrial areas that connect to the road network that will come through this Basalt Creek area. And so the transportation system plan was actually done first. So we had the Basalt Creek Transportation Refinement Plan adopted before we adopted the concept plan, and that's going back to some of the information City was presenting in terms of there is sort of this assumed regional trip, like growth that this area will service, but there's also like a local planning area trip rate that's assumed and what the transportation system that's being planned for can accommodate. And so if for some reason regional growth is higher or the local planning area growth is higher and we have higher trips, then the current system as planned won't be sufficient, and we would have to look at additional projects. But so there's also this foundation of the whole transportation system is built on a freight network as opposed to like a local like residential or more town center type development. It really is focused and planned for that industrial growth.
Thanks for the context. Commissioner Carr, do you want to start?
Yeah, if you could pop up a map that shows our area and the Tualatin area, that I think would help me. Because I'm encouraged by the Graham's Ferry growth.
Do I have one that, I mean, this doesn't show the concept plan, but it does show the whole area. Yeah,
I think Cindy was pretty thorough in taking Tualatin off these slides.
Yeah. Well, we have to play with our neighbors.
We do. Oh, let's see. I'll go back to, there is a slide that has more of that area somewhere in here. Oh, yeah, what is going on here?
There it
That
is.
one.
That one.
Okay.
So they have a manufacturing park that's is on the other side of the Basalt Creek Parkway where we have light industrial. And then everything to the right of that is more residential, right? Are we expecting that the light industrial on the north side of the Wilsonville, is that going to be frontage to the Basalt Creek Parkway, or is the access to that going to come from feeder streets, right? Like, whereas I'm imagining Day Road is going to be potentially a frontage road for the high tech or the high tech employment area, and it also for the Coffee Creek. So how are people going to get to the businesses that are in these different sections?
So not off the,
Go ahead, Cindy.
I was just going to say, not off the Basalt Creek Parkway.
Not off the Parkway. That doesn't make sense. Yeah.
The
So
only,
it's like-
the only two intersections that the Parkway will have is at Graham's Ferry and at Boone's Ferry.
Okay.
Because for a lot of the length of it, it's going to be elevated. As between Graham's and Boone's, it has to go over the canyon. So it will be,
Which means
up.
Day Road is going to be the feeder for this whole area.
yes.
Okay.
So Graham's Ferry, Day Road, and Boone's Ferry are the main arterials.
And then
And those also have limited intersections.
okay, so
So-
those won't be frontage road, there won't be business frontages off those roads.
Well, the businesses would front onto them, but driveway access
Will
is
be
not going to
behind.
be available, yes. So, the intersections would be, for instance, at Clay and Graham's, and then at Day, Graham's and Garden Acres, because there will be a roundabout there. And then there would be one intersection midway between Graham's Ferry and Boone's Ferry on Day Road. And for instance, in Coffee Creek, the supporting streets in Coffee Creek are what provide that internal connectivity. And then those would feed up to that Day Road intersection. The exception to that in Coffee Creek is that there is not a supporting street on the south side of those properties that front, so there's going to have to be some type of driveway access there. For instance, like Delta Logistics has a driveway onto Day Road.
Okay.
So there's one more parcel to the east of that, so there's going to have to be something done there. But yeah, the idea is that there will be enough internal local street connections, whether those are supporting streets like in Coffee Creek where they're a private street in a public easement, but they would provide that internal connectivity.
Okay, that makes sense. Is there enough arterial to get to the West Railroad, or is that one of the major constraints?
So the only way to get into West Railroad
Okay.
is from Graham's Ferry. Yeah, at the south end of West Railroad.
Okay.
Yet there are other roads, and in the revised local street concept map that we did, that DKS did for Basalt Creek, there is some access shown from the north, but those are just really local, undeveloped streets at the moment. So, yeah.
So on the Graham's area, because the north border there is the Basalt Creek Parkway, and there won't be road access from there, is there any constraint as the type of building we put there, because right across the street is industrial manufacturing? There really isn't. Because if you're talking about an elevated road already.
Yeah, I think the assumption is that, for instance, the properties on Clay, those would front on Clay.
Okay.
You know, others would front on Graham's or Day or Boone's. There won't, yeah, they wouldn't be facing on to that parkway.
I'm in favor of, and I don't know if you can do this, but I'm in favor of doing for the Grams area kind of a little bit of flexibility to allow them to do light industrial and or heavy high tech. Because I think it's enough of a portion, especially if it's all one landowner, that would give them some flexibility without interfering with what's across the street in Tualatin.
And I would note, I was going to note this, so they have also been assembling land north of the parkway. So they can probably, if they want to comment about that, they can probably give us more insight on that, so.
But I'd be in favor of giving them more flexibility because it's a large parcel of land. I don't know that I would say we have to put 22 acres that's light industrial, 19 acres that's high tech. I mean, I'd give them some flexibility. But I am concerned with, do we have enough major roads, arterial roads to supply? I mean, I guess we have the high tech is, what's going to have more truck traffic, the high tech or the light industrial? I mean, because the further away we get from the freeway, the larger the arterial roads need to be to accommodate trucks.
Right.
And the more concrete.
It probably depends on how restrictive we choose to be with the difference between high-tech and light industrial. It's hard to say at this point because the majority of all industrial development in the city has been done through our PDI zoning. And the PDI RSIA really, that just provides kind of the additional requirements of Metro's Title IV for regionally significant industrial areas. So it has a few more restrictions on the commercial and land division requirements, but for the most part, we have primarily the same zoning everywhere for industrial. So if you were to say, like, in terms of the development typologies that were presented earlier for those different land use types, because you have more mix of building types or assumptions between kind of having more of a mix of buildings and types of jobs, you're probably going to have some jobs that are going to be interfaced less with like freight trucks, and that you would typically see in like the development typologies that were modeled for the light industrial, more truck traffic there. But if you don't regulate as much distinction, like some of this was, there wasn't a decision yet in the concept plan about, which is why we're having these discussions with you, is are we going to regulate that or are we going to incentivize that? Is that this like aspirational, we hope that's what we get and we want to make sure that the transportation system can support it, but the zoning really isn't different between these different areas? Or was it to establish maybe similar zoning so that it all is very cohesive and maybe the design overlay, but then have some slight distinctions between craft industrial and high tech and light industrial? That level of granularity hasn't really been decided yet. Specificity, yeah, I don't know why I went the other direction. That really wasn't decided through the concept planning process, and is part of what's embedded in these conversations with you, which is it could just be incentive based, in which case it probably could be even at that point, depending on how much freight.
Do we need to parse it out into this high tech, craft and light industrial? Do we need to be that granular, or can we? Specific. Specific specificity, yeah, right. Do we have to be that prescriptive?
I think these are the land use types that were established in the concept plan. We want some level of like consistency with the concept plan, but how we choose to do that is still open-ended. So that's what I would say, is like how specific we want to get is part of this discussion, and whether that specific is done through, like it can be done through different like land use standards, but it could also, like, you could be more prescriptive or limited in one of the areas. Or you could choose to instead do it as more incentive-based through the code or through economic development programs, or even through like the design, like maybe you care more about the design overlay being where the high tech is, more so than in the light industrial. And that's kind of, how do we want to draw those distinctions is what we're doing now. So
I kind of looked at the light industrial as it was a blending between manufacturing and the high tech, and that's kind of why we had it partitioned in that top section. And also because it's further away from the freeway, it would be less truck intensive, and the fact that Clay Road is not really designed for heavy truck traffic yet.
right, well, Clay would be redesigned with development.
It would have to be. Right.
And I think part of it, we didn't really talk much earlier about the context of light industrial. I mean, I think part of the context for light industrial up by Clay Road was that interface with the prison, the correctional facility, and that the design on Clay Road might be less important, but like it's a lower visibility street, right? Like
Sure.
really most people, it's going to be a dead end there. So if you're going down Clay Road to visit whatever, 2 to 4 businesses end up being on that street or whatever it is, versus the high visibility of Day Road and Graham's Ferry Road and Boone's Ferry Road, which is going to be where like 90% of the traffic in this area goes.
Right. Which you could save money on Clay by not making it as pretty. Right, you'd spend the money on the concrete rather than.
And you might be less specific about what type of businesses you want to see there and what type of buildings and the number of employees. So I think, some of the, I'm remembering too much about this project tonight. The canyon and the wetland is also an important attribute to the industrial area that is marked as high-tech and craft industrial. So that was a part of the discussion as well. You have it has like 4 different names, but like Tapman Creek, the Basalt Creek Canyon, but that whole wetland area, the idea of like having a campus that has, the ability to access that wetland area, that natural amenity, was also something attractive to the council when these discussions were happening about what types of employment are we hoping to see here someday, and how do we plan for those. I would know, if it's helpful, we'll send out the transportation refinement plan for you, because I know some of these questions about like traffic and trips, and all of these roads will be upgraded. So like Day Road eventually, I believe, is going to be a 5-lane road.
Okay.
And the Basalt Creek Parkway, which is currently constructed for 3, will also be 5. Where it'll be a bridge will be pre-built for that full right-of-way, but there are portions that the county has only built to 3-lane at this point in time. So the whole system gets an upgrade as all of this development occurs, so it will be able to handle more capacity than it does today.
Miranda, how do you apply these land use designations we're talking about to pre-existing parcels that have pre-existing uses or development on it? How do you do that?
So, do you want me to?
Yeah, I know.
I'll just preface this too with just a quick time awareness check too. And we can keep talking about it because we still have time at the end, a little bit on the informational section, but just awareness that we have like 5 minutes, 5 to 10 folks. But let's keep it going. Okay.
So in terms, some of it, and Miranda can add in here, is that the actual zoning doesn't come until it's annexed. So if you have an existing use in the county that stays in the county, that zoning's not applying until it's developed. And also when you're applying the zoning, this question of how you approach it through zoning is also, we mentioned it a bit, but you can either, to form whether the type of use, you can either be like an inclusive list of, it needs to be one of these uses, or, exclude uses that we're concerned this use is going to consume the high-tech industrial. So we're going to eliminate that in the high-tech industrial, but then be, allowing of others that may or may not happen, but we're not too concerned about happening and taking up land from the intended use. So there's kind of, you can approach it from both ends or a combo.
Commissioner Miller.
Okay, so to answer the questions that were handed before us, so I'll go in the ones that I feel like are easier to answer than the ones that are more difficult. The Boone's Ferry Consortia or Assembly, that feels like a no-brainer to make that one type. Whichever type we choose, I think making it one type for ease of development makes sense. I'm leaning towards making, let's be aspirational. You know, you got me all aspirational with all this discussion. And so using it for high-tech space is something that seems like it would be an appropriate use for that. Such a large area. It checks so many boxes that we've heard about on economic development. And so it seems like a great opportunity to be more aspirational. In terms of what things should be avoided or discouraged, I would hate for a distribution warehouse type work to happen here because it may just be a bias that I'm not educated enough on, but I don't think our I-5 situation could handle a distribution center. So unless we had line of sight for concurrency for that being resolved, I think we need to be very limiting on things that are going to drive a significant amount of trips. I think that answers most of your questions.
Thank you. Commissioner Semenova, do you want to react or first thoughts on the questions? You can say no, it's okay.
I think I'm good for now.
And this is an ongoing discussion too, so if we have additional thoughts on this, we can discuss more, or do you need these now?
No, absolutely. We'll have more opportunities.
Because I feel like there's just a lot of good points coming up that, and for myself personally, I'd love to rewatch the conversation and kind of just process a little bit more before giving. But I do agree about the one ownership. I agree with that. Any other thoughts on these three questions? Okay. Seeing none, then I think I'll do the public comment now. I've not forgotten about you. Or do you want to do public comment? I guess I shouldn't have assumed.
I'll make a few statements.
So in terms of process,
Ryan, you can come here, the microphone's up.
do I need to reread the public comment for Zoom attendees? Yes. Okay, this is the time, I got it. This is the time that citizens have the opportunity to address the Planning Commission regarding any item that is not already scheduled for a formal public hearing or a public work session tonight. Therefore, if any member of the audience, either here or in City Hall or via Zoom, would like to speak about any other matter concerned, please raise your hand or send a message to the city recorder using the Zoom chat function so that we may hear from you now. If you have not already, please fill out a testimony card, give it to the clerk. Please state your name and your address for the record, or state that your address is provided on the testimony card. You're already at the podium. Make sure I'm unmuted, and you get be sorry. Keep it around 3 minutes. We're kind of tight on the agenda, but other than that, I'll.
3 minutes. You guys spoke for 9 minutes.
I recognize that.
I only get 3. Okay, all joking aside, actually, Cindy, could you go to the, back to your presentation, because you're the one with all the graphics and images.
Can you please start with an introduction of
sorry.
yourself? Sorry.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Brian Shera, I'm with
Thank you.
Schnitzer Properties. We're the aggregation on Graham's Ferry. It's the Graham's Ferry assemblage. And we've owned the property for about 2 years now. And as you've seen on the map, it's split zoned. And it's split zoned in the concept plan. And so what we develop is right along what Matt was referring to as kind of the engine for Wilsonville, which is manufacturing, wholesale trade, distribution. And really what we develop supports the entire ecosystem that is the west side of Portland. So you have a lot of high tech, you have a lot of industrial uses that need suppliers, that need space for their manufacturing, their fabrication. So we just did a project in Sherwood. We have a mix, and that mix is manufacturing, high tech, distribution, and they service all of the industries that we think of on the west side. And they are those kind of mid-sized, smaller businesses that is very much Wilsonville. So when we look at, this piece of property, and one, aggregation of a larger piece of property is pretty rare. And if you follow industrial land development in the Portland metro area, Matt was referring to 10 acres or more. Most developers will say 25 acres or more, typically. So this is about 50 acres. And, our intention is always, we're a long-term holder. We don't build, sell, and flip. We build Class A mixed industrial development for a mix of uses, because those uses are the community and serve the community. So just a couple comments. When it comes to split zoning and, boundaries, so back when they created this plan, they were doing what you're doing now, and they're trying to predict the future. And now here we are aggregating a large acreage between these two hypothetical uses, and it didn't work, right? So to Commissioner Carr's point, why do we need the colors and the boundaries? If you go back to the slide that had the Coffee Creek high-tech industrial examples on it.
Let's see here. So these ones?
Those are light industrial buildings. Those aren't high-tech buildings. That is a high-tech use in a light industrial building is what that is, and vice versa. So light industrial and high-tech can coexist on one piece of property in one zone. So the PDI zone that really is Wilsonville already accommodates all these uses. So Mentor Graphics is in PDI, but then so is a lot of your distributors. They're also in PDI. So you've already got a great zone that allows a mix and it's actually attractive to developers, because what'll end up happening is if you don't have a zone that is attractive to developers, you have to ask yourself, well, then who's going to build it? And if you're asking yourself who's going to build it, okay, then you got to ask how are you going to finance it? So I can't go to a bank with a construction loan, I can't go to a bank with a construction loan with a piece of property that is split zoned and get a construction loan for $150 million. That's just not going to happen. They're going to look at the property and say, nope, no thanks. So then what happens? Then the property sits vacant and fallow. And if the property sits vacant and fallow, the infrastructure doesn't get built. And if the infrastructure doesn't get built, none of the other district areas are going to get built. Well, there's one other way. The city pays for it. So if we have a mix of uses, industrial uses, you want to add in tech, that's fine. Craft industrial, that's fine too. I would advocate for one zone for the whole district, except maybe along Day Road if you want to have some higher standards for Day Road. I could see that. But for the rest of your district, you're trying to get all these stars to align in terms of what land seller is ready to sell, what developer out there is ready to spend their time buying each little piece of property to get a site large enough to develop and to fit within whatever color we are currently showing on the map. That is very difficult. And these properties will sit vacant for a very long time. I promise, okay? So if there is a mix of uses and they can be aspirational, I would work in the aspirational uses to be allowed in addition to the PDI. And that way, if, we get a tech company that wants to locate in our light industrial building, like you see in the example here, we can do that. As opposed to, no, this is light industrial, and then right across the street is high tech, but, it doesn't work that way. And there's nothing wrong with high tech and light industrial working together cohesively. And they service each other in the same complex, They can coexist, and again, they can service that whole industrial supply chain and ecosystem that is the rest of the west side, Sherwood, Wilsonville, Beaverton, down to Salem. Sorry, a couple other points. Tax revenue. So again, back to if it sits fallow and vacant, we talked about who's going to pay for the infrastructure. You have tens of millions of dollars of infrastructure that needs to be out here. Roads, sewer, storm and sanitary, water. I mean, it's quite extensive. But then it gets to your tax base. So we recently went through this very same process with City of Tualatin a year ago. And they finally got it when it was, hey, if you go aspirational, just know, and it's aspirational only, just know that this land will sit here. And that's no tax revenue. Tax revenue for your schools, for your roads, for your parks. It will just sit vacant. So you really do got to factor that into your thinking. And again, there's nothing wrong with adding in the aspirational, but to completely say it's this or that and nothing else, it's going to be really hard to develop this entire district. Another comment would be, there's only 5 or 6 developers in Portland that can even build this. I mean, they should be at the table too, and they'll say the same thing that I am. Maybe I'll just be the voice, but it's very rare for, and this hasn't happened since the 80s or 90s. When we were talking with City of Tualatin, we did a study of their Levington district, which had only the MP zone there. And it's a very restrictive manufacturing zone, which is only looking for Novelis, JAE, et cetera. Well, the reality is, what company has come to Oregon to build just a manufacturing facility or just a headquarters anymore? That hasn't happened since the 90s. And so the look that we did in concert with the city was, you have 4 to 5, 25 acre or more large parcels that have been sitting vacant for almost 30 years, 35 years. And if you do the opportunity cost missed out on tax revenue over 35 years, it was hundreds of millions of dollars. So that's just kind of I'm just adding on and piling on here. Anyways, but I mean, in reality, trying to get financing for a development is, especially with restrictive uses or a split zone site, you'll just never get a bank to agree to something like that. And then it's not like who's going to build the high tech, right? Developers don't just go building an office building saying, Google's going to come one day. I just know it. It doesn't happen that way. So anyways, I'm probably gone over my time, but anyways, I just want to continue the conversation and, just kind of give a little bit of perspective of, what we're faced with and kind of how we think about it, so.
Thank you for
anyways.
sharing your perspective, and I don't know if any of the commissioners have any other questions or comments based off of that, but it's good to know moving forward too, to have that context. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I think with that, we are going to conclude our work session for this evening. I apologize that we are over time. And I think we'll just move on to the next agenda item, which are just a couple informational pieces around the council meetings that have happened and our work plan. Are there any questions from commissioners on our work plan or anything like that? Okay, seeing none, then I'm going to move on to adjournment. So do I have a motion?
I move that we adjourn.
Sweet, do we have a second?
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and seconded, so we are adjourned at 7:51 PM. Thank you.
Good job.